this moment, the representatives of 130 countries are marking Earth Day in New York by signing the Paris Climate Agreement. And in 2014, Presidents Obama and Xi Jinping announced that we would set aggressive targets for carbon reductions. In 2015, we set those targets. Today, the U.S. and China, of course, the world's two biggest economies and two biggest emitters, are signing on the dotted line. Climate is one important example of the contribution that U.S. China cooperation can make and is making to the meeting global challenges. For me, the story starts with somebody who's now an Angelino, someone you'll hear from this afternoon, Jeff Bader. I had the privilege of working with Jeff over the years and following him in some really great jobs in government. So when he came in as President Obama's top Asia advisor and asked me to join his team, I, of course, jumped at the chance. And we started on the National Security Council on January 20th, 2009, President Obama's first day in office. So what we experienced is that as the first Pacific president and as a new president grappling with the worst economic situation since the Depression, Obama understood the importance to America of the entire Asia-Pacific region. He recognized that the economic and the demographic trends were driving towards a Pacific century. And he knew that America's national security interests and its economic interests would be served by better economic integration, more security cooperation, and tackling big problems together across the Pacific. That's why he decided to rebalance, to allocate more attention and resources to this region, rebuilding our alliances, building new partnerships, strengthening regional institutions, strengthening the rule of law, and engaging deeply with China. But to understand the administration's approach to China, it's critical to understand that our Asia policy is about America's interest, and America's interest in the entire region, beginning with our traditional allies and our partners, but with an emphasis on building an inclusive regional architecture with institutions. And our China policy is a subset of our Asia policy, not the other way around. So the context for the progress that we've made with China includes the President's active engagement with ASEAN and the 10 member countries. It includes also the quality of our alliances, particularly with Japan, Republic of Korea, with Australia. It also includes our support for a democratic Taiwan and for universal values and human rights. It includes the successful negotiation of the TPP and the strength of U.S. businesses and investors across Asia. It includes the credibility of our security presence. These are the things that generate confidence that we're in the region to stay, that we're committed to a rules-based regional order that benefits all of us, not only the U.S., and that we won't accept the division of the region into spheres of influence. And I believe that our policy towards China has made clear that we're determined to avoid either a G2 condominium or a Cold War strategic rivalry. From day one, this administration has been clear-eyed about China, both about the potential for cooperation and about the potential for conflict. That's why President Obama has invested so much time, so much thought, so much effort in seeking practical cooperation, in managing and in resolving differences, and in trying to shape China's choices to encourage responsible stewardship and encourage contributions to global leadership. President Obama has held face-to-face meetings with Chinese leaders, something on the order of 30 times so far in his tenure in office. And that's in addition to phone calls, to letters, to many meetings of envoys, secretaries of state and treasury and others. This has been absolutely critical in dealing with what is, after all, a top-down system. Early in 2011, looking ahead to the change in leadership at the 18th Party Congress, Jeff Bader asked the president to propose an exchange of visits between then Vice President Xi Jinping and Vice President Biden as part of a mutual effort to build relationships between our top leaders. And the result was a series of really extraordinary private conversations, first in Chengdu, then here in LA in 2012. That's what gave us, I think, our first real set of insights into Xi Jinping and got that relationship off on a solid footing. And once Xi Jinping took office, we looked at the calendar and realized it was going to be something on the order of a year before the two presidents found themselves together at an international meeting. So we came up with the idea of an informal retreat away from the capital, something that would allow for more intimate and direct, candid, extended conversations. The result was the Sunnylands Summit in 2013. And we've developed that model further by supplementing state visits with extended private sessions that allow the leaders to talk. This concerted, sustained, high-level engagement has been invaluable. It's been the driving force behind some important achievements in the bilateral relationship and has been a vehicle for preventing problems from getting out of hand. Equally important has been our success in building up institutional engagements with the Chinese system. There are many of them, like the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, like the Strategic Security Dialogue, and so on. These mechanisms allow us to engage with the Chinese bureaucracy, with the imprimatur of the two leaders, to work through differences and to advance practical cooperation. The net effect of all of this has been to put a floor under the relationship, a floor that can absorb considerable stress without risking conflict, and that enables both sides, including our two militaries, to better understand the other even when we can't agree. Now, as China's economy and global interests have grown, its foreign policy, its security policies have evolved. And so, too, has the extent and the character of our cooperation. For example, to appreciate just how far we've come on climate, remember that in 2009, China firmly rejected calls to limit greenhouse gas emissions, claiming it would unfairly limit the economic growth in developing countries. Now, literally, as we speak, Vice Premier Zhang Gaoli is signing the Paris Agreement in New York. China's committed that by 2030 their CO2 emissions will peak and 1/5 of their energy will be renewable. To appreciate how far we've come on proliferation. Remember that China used to claim the right and the need to allow, quote, legitimate commercial transfer of dual-use items to avoid taking action against proliferators. Well, now China's working to remove chemical weapon stocks from Syria and helping to make Iran's heavy water research reactor proliferation resistant. China's working with us also on North Korea. 7 years ago, Chinese leaders were reluctant to take on responsibility in dealing with regional hotspots. They invoked the doctrine of non-intervention in other countries' affairs. Well, now they're taking an active role in training Afghan diplomats, mediating between Pakistan and the Taliban. Now they've become the largest contributor to UN peacekeepers among the P5 and the Security Council. Their navy participates in counter-piracy patrols along the coast of Africa. 7 years ago, China was in denial about wildlife trafficking, despite being the world's largest consumer. Now, we're working together to implement a nearly complete ban on the import, export, sale of ivory in both our countries. 7 years ago, it was rare, almost unheard of, for China to partner with others, let alone with us, on aid to developing countries. Now, after having cooperated in addressing the Ebola crisis in West Africa, we're coordinating on the global health and security agenda, an important initiative. 7 years ago, China depended almost entirely on exports to keep its economy growing and resisted efforts to further integrate the region around high standards for trade and investment. Now, policymakers in Beijing understand China's need for internal economic reforms and the need for a transition to consumer-driven economy. They've gone from disparaging the TPP to asking about it. We've made significant progress in negotiating towards a bilateral investment treaty. And even the much discussed Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, after a lot of work and a lot of cajoling, has made significant progress toward adopting the standards and the accountability of existing development banks. And the initial projects of the AIIB will be conducted in partnership with the Asia Development Bank. Those are all steps forward. 7 years ago, our military-to-military relations were narrow, they were pro forma, and they were frequently suspended and interrupted. And the danger is obvious. We all remember the EP3 incident. Now, we've established regular military dialogues and frequent high-level exchanges. We've put in place confidence-building measures that reduce the risk of incidents and provide tools for managing a crisis should an incident occur. 7 years ago, fewer than 100,000 Chinese were studying in America. Now, as you know, that number is more than tripled, and tourist and business visas have jumped to over 2.3 million a year. Now, the other side of the story is the set of issues where we have very significant differences. North Korea, which I touched on, is one that increasingly straddles both of those worlds. On the one hand, China has found it very difficult to use its leverage to stem the profound security threat of North Korea's pursuit of nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. On the other hand, there is an uptick in cooperation between us and a growing convergence between China and the United States on the need for much stronger measures to rein North Korea in. Cyber has also long been a source of real tension in our relationship. For years, the Chinese turned deaf ears to our complaints about state-sponsored, cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property belonging to American businesses that was then turned around by Chinese businesses to gain competitive advantage. Ultimately, it was the prospect of a very strong sanctions package that changed the value proposition for Chinese leaders when it comes to cyber-enabled theft for commercial gain. So in the weeks prior to President Xi Jinping's visit to Washington last fall for a state visit, he dispatched a top Chinese official, Meng Jianzhu, to negotiate with us. And ultimately, we got from the Chinese side at least a promise to end state support for cyber theft. A chronic friction point is China's suppression of universal freedoms. The human rights picture in China wasn't good 7 years ago, but it has gotten significantly worse, with troubling crackdowns on political expression, on civil society, on ethnic minorities. These increasingly harsh and restrictive practices harm China, alienate its friends. They're hugely frustrating to supporters of the U.S. China relationship. Now, we consistently raise our concerns. We raise them in public, but we raise them in private. We address both problematic policies and individual problems and cases. And in the past few years in particular, we've seen a shift, and we have been working with like-minded countries to discourage, or at least to amend, a whole spate of draft laws and draft regulations in China that not only would restrict the freedom of speech or the rights of Chinese citizens, but that would discriminate against U.S. businesses, U.S. organizations, U.S. interests. Now, by far and away the most visible and publicized, widely covered area of friction with China is over its behavior towards competing claimants and its neighbors in the East and the South China Sea. And I want to underscore up front that this is not a territorial dispute between the US and China. We don't make any claims to any of these islands for ourselves or for our allies. We don't favor anyone else's claims to land features in the South China Sea over China's. Now, in Beijing, we hear a lot of tough talk about China defending its indisputable sovereignty. But sovereignty over exactly what is the question? Is it over recognized land features in keeping with international law? Or is it sovereignty over the global sea lanes and the maritime areas, many of which fall within 200 miles of the coasts of other countries? There's an important distinction to be made between the two types of claims, although all claims need to be made in ways that are consistent with international law. Territorial claims are notoriously hard to resolve, and some of these claims long predate even the creation of the People's Republic of China. But maritime claims were dealt with comprehensively in the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which China ratified. It covers issues such as who has jurisdiction to fish or to drill in any given location. It covers the rights and the freedoms enjoyed at sea. It guarantees to all countries the freedoms of navigation, of overflight, of other lawful uses of the sea. We don't ask China to renounce its claims, either in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, but we do ask China to renounce unilateral and destabilizing actions that change the status quo at the expense of other claimants. We don't object to China exercising international maritime rights, but we do urge it to clarify its South China Sea maritime claims consistent with international law, and to recognize that other countries possess the same rights as China itself exercises. We don't seek to undermine Chinese interests, but we are determined not to let China undermine the interests of all other nations, including the United States. Those interests include the rights and freedoms allowed under international law. They include the principles of the UN Charter, such as freedom from coercion. Well, is freedom of navigation really in jeopardy? Hey, China has begun warning and seeking to divert ships and planes that are operating near its built-up outposts in the Spratlys. Is lawful commerce really being impeded? Well, local fishermen are being chased out of their traditional fishing grounds. Do China's neighbors really face coercion and threats of military force? Well, PLA Navy warships are loitering in disputed waters, not to mention the newly built military outposts on disputed features, which are replete with military-grade ports and airfields and other facilities. Are the claimants free to seek peaceful, lawful dispute resolution? Well, China has pulled out the stops in vilifying the Philippines for pursuing arbitration as stipulated in the Law of the Sea Treaty. Is somebody militarizing this region? Well, the 10 leaders of ASEAN certainly think so, judging by their statements. And they're speaking out against behavior that contravenes the 2002 agreement they reached with China, the Declaration on Conduct. But isn't the U.S. the one that's militarizing? No. Our military operates as it has operated for decades. Our military operates worldwide along the same principles. Our military operates in a manner that is fully consistent with international law. There is no right that the U.S. claims or exercises that we don't also respect in other countries, including China. And our presence is fully supported by the coastal states of Southeast Asia. So, what's next? Well, we're looking for a path forward that respects the rights and interests of all parties and all claimants. We think that the Law of the Sea arbitration case brought by the Philippines can clarify the maritime entitlements of both the Philippines and China in a way that narrows the maritime area that's in dispute between them. So legalese aside, we think that the decision, whatever it will be, could open up space for all claimants to step back, take a deep breath, and attempt meaningful discussions of things like resource management, of joint development. And we hope that this decision can serve as a springboard towards a modus vivendi in the South China Sea that will lower tensions. So here's the bottom line. This administration has worked from the outset with determination, in good faith, to establish a U.S. China relationship that's productive and that also allows for healthy competition. We set out, and I believe that we have largely succeeded, in establishing a framework that fosters practical cooperation on issues that matter to both of us and matter to the world, but that also helps us solve, or at least narrow, or at least manage disagreements peacefully. We've also avoided not only the Thucydides trap, but also the accommodationist trap, where accepting China's core interests is the price for cooperation globally or for trade benefits. We have consistently welcomed China at the table of global rulemaking, but have tried at the same time to make clear China's commensurate responsibility to cooperate in maintaining the global order. We've tried to make clear its obligation to accept that the rules apply to all of us. The global system will be stronger and the global economy will grow faster. Global challenges will be easier to address if China is pulling its weight and working with us. Now, we all know that China faces many internal challenges: slowing economic growth, overcapacity, local government debt, capital market instability, necessary but disruptive economic reform, a rapidly aging population, pollution, urbanization, and frankly, despite some positive messages early in Xi Jinping's term, many of the reforms seem to have bogged down or stalled. And we all know that reform is hard, it's complicated. Hey, we've got our own issues. But the viability of the Chinese economy and the stability of Chinese society is dependent on the leadership making hard decisions, good decisions. As President Obama has said, the United States benefits from a stable and prospering China. We have a stake in China's success. We have more to fear from a weak China than from a strong one. So effectively addressing its domestic challenges and doing so that in a way that's consistent with universal rights and consistent with international law is going to be important both for the Chinese people, for the American people, and for the world. So I know that all of you share the view that we want China to succeed, and I look forward to the results of your hard work at this conference today. Thank you very much.